Okay, so today we are going to talk about um, the ancient Egypt of the Old Kingdom. So, what that means is, time period wise, about 2600 to 2200 BC. And it was a time of increased trade, and magnificent cities were built, and the government was unified. And the big thing is that the people believed that everyone working together and being unified um, was the key to their success. Okay, and they believed that their ruler was the key. And so they believed that the ruler should be both a religious leader and a political leader. And whenever you have a government where the politics and the religion are controlled by the same person, that's called a theocracy. Okay, and they really thought if this leader was called on by the gods, often sometimes considered a son of a god, and they thought that this leader would bring them through any kind of disasters or wars or famine or anything like that. Okay, at first the kings, they were called kings, and then eventually they started being called pharaohs. Pharaohs literally was referring to the great house that they lived in, the palace that the king lived in, and so the word becomes meaning the person who lives in that house, right? So the pharaoh, of course, ruled with complete power, but couldn't do everything, of course, himself. So he has a lot of people to work with him. I mentioned before that they believe that he was the son of a god. Originally, it was the sun god. Most people say Ra, but a lot of historians think it really should be said more Re, or spelled with Re. There's not one right way, but I will say your book likes the Re way. And he's a well respected historian, but I do know that most of you know him as Ra. Okay. All right, so this pharaoh has a lot of helpers. The book uses the word bureaucrats. That is not an Egyptian word. It's just a word meaning, right, whenever you have government officials who take care of the day-to-day things, like being in charge of all the construction projects like the dams or the canals, or making sure the grain is stored correctly, so they have, something to eat in the, so they don't starve sometimes. So anyway, they really followed the pharaoh, and he had ultimate control. He was also the religious leader, so he would do things like ride a bull around Memphis to, they thought that doing things like that symbolically would help bring, fertility to the soil. Or if he cut the first grain at the harvest time, that meant that they're going to have, abundant crops. So both religiously and politically leading. Okay. All right. Now let's talk about religion for a second. I know you know that they were polytheistic, meaning they believed in many gods. And there is a picture of Re, or Ra, the sun god. There's also many others. A few of the important ones. Happy was the river god. So, of course, the Nile being so important to their life. We're going to talk about some of these gods when we talk about the Book of the Dead a little bit later, but and the videos. Osiris and Isis are important at being the ruler of the underworld, or the world of the dead. Thoth is the god of learning, and he's in there too. All the thing, we'll talk about all these, but what's interesting about these gods is they're often shown with animal heads, as you can see in the picture. They thought that the gods could change form. They could be human-like or animal form, and that's what that's representing there. Okay? All right, and then going on to the afterlife, the Egyptians thought that the afterlife was going to be wonderful. So they had a very positive view, even thinking it's better than what they have now. They just have to kind of go through this long journey to get there, and then they'll have peace forever. Okay. At first, they thought that the only person who really was going to get this afterlife and all the things that they needed to do to get there was for the pharaoh. And then over time, this changes, and of course, then it became, high-ranking officials, and then over time, even then, it got to be that other people could have it too. Okay, so an important part of the rituals was something called the Book of the Dead. And we will watch a video that explains this a little bit more. But basically, the Book of the Dead is a collection of prayers or magic spells, and it's going to help them in the afterlife to get through that long journey. And there's going to be a lot of danger. You might meet mythical creatures, and you might need to know passwords. And the Book of the Dead has all the spells in it and passwords and information and how you should act around the gods and all these things to help them be successful in their journey. Okay, some of the spells are called things like for repelling a crocodile which comes to take away. So how to repel that crocodile, or for being transformed into a phoenix, right? How you can escape. So the Book of the Dead was originally more for the elite, the royalty, people like that. And then over time, really long time, then it became more the common people if you could afford it. Now, it was still something you had to pay for a scribe to make for you, and it was very expensive. So, of course, it would depend on how big of your manual would be how much you could afford to spend. Okay. So the manual that you had made for you by the scribe would be put in your tomb with you. It would be buried with you. And that was supposed to be for you to use, right? So you had the spells with you in the afterlife. And so think of it, eventually it became so commonplace that scribes, this was something, think of it kind of like today, how you can go on Amazon and make your own self-published book, right? It's something that they would just do for you and sell like a commodity, right? And they had like different packages, how many spells you could put in there, and they would individualize it, put your name in there and things like that. Okay. So no two copies that have been found are ever alike, and often, like I said, you find the name of the person who was mentioned it was personalized for them. Okay. All right. And like I said, it was expensive, so it depends on how much you could afford it. All right. Now, that was something to help you get through the afterlife. But first, they thought it was very important to preserve their dead. And so there was a lot of ceremonies. And the big part, of course, is the embalming, or making them into a mummy. So embalming means the process that you treat the body with to make sure it doesn't decay. This probably happened naturally at first because of the hot, arid location and the sand and the mummifications they might have stumbled on by accident at first. And then, of course, over the years, the process gets refined. The quality of your mummification would also depend on how much you could afford to pay for it. Okay, so again, definitely more for the nobility than the common people. It took about 70 days to go through the whole process, and this is the process. So first of all, the body would probably be washed first, and then they would take the brain out through the nose. They did not think the brain was any good to you in the afterlife, so they would basically stick a poker up there and squish it around and liquefy it and then pour it out your nose. I know, not too attractive, right? And the rest of your organs would also be taken out except the heart, because they thought the heart was very important for the afterlife, and they left that in the body. The organs were taken out and they were put in these jars, canopic jars, and each of the jars would be for one of your organs, and the heads were symbolic of gods that were going to protect your organs, and these organs would be buried in your tomb with you. Okay. After that, they would put salt around your body, And the body, the salt was called natron, and it would sometimes they'd put packets of it in your body too, in body cavity, and they would let it sit for a while to like suck up the moisture out of your skin. And so after that time, when they would take it out, the mummy would be somewhat sunken, and so they would maybe stuff some linen also back in. Sometimes false eyes were added to make it look better. Sometimes they put burial spices in the body to make it smell better, and made the outside skin with some oils. And then they would wrap the body with strips of linen, which is what you know of like as the mummy, right? And sometimes it was very intricately done, all in between the fingers and everything. Sometimes they would have amulets inside the different layers of the linen wraps that they thought would help protect them, and they would say magical words. This was a important priest's job, and they would wear masks, the animal heads, and it was a big ceremony. Okay. And then once the mummy was ready, they would seal it in a coffin. Depending on the time period and the wealth of the person, sometimes the person could even be in multiple coffins. They're called nested coffins. And sometimes they would have these fancy sarcophagi. A sarcophagus is usually stone. So again, that would show you're having more money if you can afford a fancier coffin, right? So that could be just a box, wood box, or like I said, sometimes throughout history, there were nested coffins became, you know what I mean by nested? Like a bigger coffin was, a little one was placed into a bigger one, then a bigger one, like nesting dolls, like Russian nesting dolls. And then where they would put the coffin, after they put the body in the coffin, then it would go into a tomb. And a tomb could also depend on your wealth and the time period, what was popular at the time, right? So the poor, of course, are going to end up being maybe directly in the sand or in a cave. If you're wealthier, you could have these stone tombs. And of course, we know that we'll talk about for pharaohs, they decided theirs had to be really fancy, and they made them into pyramids, right? Okay. Also, I'd like to say that they mummified more than people. There are a lot of animals that have been found. Baboons, bulls. Some of these are ones that are representative of the gods, they thought, right? Like they're heads of the gods. Cats are very important to them, and so they think it honors the gods and goddesses to also mummify these animals. Okay, so we know that the Egyptians were quite skilled medically. We have some of their papyrus scrolls that are basically the first medical books, and we know that they knew how to use splints to try to help broken bones, and they knew quite a bit, obviously, with all the internal workings. Okay, so I mentioned the tombs for the king, so let's talk about that. So really early on, mastabas were what they're called, and they were somewhere to put the dead. And even today, if you go to a cemetery, right nowadays it's the trend to usually bury the body in a coffin in a cemetery, right? Well, back in the day, there was a mastaba was a rectangular structure that would be built over the grave, and it was made of mud and brick, right? At the time, that was what it was popular. So think of it just as like a little house for the dead that was put over their grave. Okay. Well, then it started, that's what it might have looked like. Okay, a mastaba. And then over time, that started getting built up, and so we are going to eventually get to the pyramids. So we'll talk about that in a second. Before I get on to that, I just want to mention here that you are buried with offerings because they think you're going to live in the next life, right? So you're buried with clothing and weapons and furniture and things that you might need for the afterlife. Okay, and so let's see. I want to also show you. Um, there's also during some periods we find these small kind of dolls, and those are Shabadi. And Shabadi figurines are meant to be servants for you to help you in the afterlife, right? So they thought that you're going to have, farming was their main thing, right? So farming, you're going to farm in the afterlife, and you're going to have this wonderful life and this beautiful farm. But if you're wealthy, you don't want to do all the work yourself, right? So they have these little Shabadi dolls that they believed would be like your workers in the afterlife. And some people even, depends on what they look like throughout history, maybe some of them were dressed more like servants. So maybe they also, gave you some to be servants in the afterlife. Okay, so that is not a real mummy or anything. It's like a little doll. Okay, so I said that they're eventually going to start making these very large pyramids. It started with something called the Step Pyramid of Djoser, which is one that was not very advanced. And I have a video I will show you about this. And it was probably first a mastaba, and then he started building it up higher, and then that eventually got to be like the pyramid shape. Okay. Then, of course, what you think of is the pyramids like this. So there's a man named Imhotep who is written down as probably being the best, engineer of the pyramids. He's famous in the scrolls. And they're given quite a lot of credit for building these, right? Try to imagine the engineering skills it would take to make these. And the ones here in this picture, the biggest one is called the Great Pyramid, and all three of these are found in a place called Giza, okay? And they're very, very famous. So the biggest one is for King Khufu, he's is the Great Pyramid. It is considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world because it's such an amazing feat that they were able to build this so big, and it was the biggest thing for around 4,000 years. It was the tallest thing around. Also in this same location is the Sphinx, which it is not a tomb. It is just a very famous kind of like a monument, and it was that's also in the body of the head. It's limestone, and the body is a lion, and the head is supposed to be a pharaoh. And if some kids ask me sometimes what those triangular parts are around the ears, that's the headdress. That's why it looks like that. Okay, so it took years and years to build these. They would build them before the person was dead. And the question is, right, they're huge. It has a big, huge square base, covering very, blocks. They are, it would take a lot of work. They're very huge stone blocks, very heavy. And they believe that depending on the time period, it could have been farmers being required to work on it in the off times, maybe also some slave labor at some times. And it is really an engineering miracle that they were able to do these things, and there's something consistent about it. Like, for instance, the entrance of the tomb always faces north, which shows that they obviously had some knowledge of astronomy, right, and were able to tell the direction. The other thing is we know that they were quite good astronomers. They had a calendar of 365 days, 12 months, 3 seasons they did versus ours, but that is the basis for our modern calendar. Also, it is clearly they're good mathematicians, right? They'd have to calculate how much stone they need. They'd have to measure all the angles to make it meet perfectly. And we also know that they invented written numbers based on 10. So this is a base 10 system, and they created fractions. We know they had whole numbers. They could add and subtract and divide with fractions and whole numbers. So quite impressive. Okay, and so this one, the Great Pyramid, is about 9 football fields. So that's how big it is. It's hard to tell from the picture, but it's very big. Probably about 500 feet tall. Okay. All right. The other thing I want to talk to you about is Egyptian society. So, first of all, before we talk about the people, one of the things that's remember from the map I showed you is that the people live very close to the Nile River. And so, if you think of the amount of land they had, they only lived in about 3% of the land because they had to live close to the river. And they used to say that you could have 1 foot in on the fertile part and then 1 foot in the desert, right? Because it's mostly desert. All right, and so how do they develop? We mentioned this a little bit earlier. There are social classes, the pretty traditional, the pharaoh's going to be at the top, and then his leaders of the army and nobles and priests would be right underneath him. And then there would be kind of the skilled is in the middle, artisans and scribes. Then underneath there would be the farmers, and the farmers are what a lot of the people are doing, right? They and then there's underneath there the unskilled workers or also slaves. Okay, so just to describe them a little bit, the upper classes would have houses of wood or sun-dried brick. So if they have wood, you can tell they have some money, right? Because they're going to have to import that because they're not going to have that in the desert very well. Their houses were also sometimes 2 to 3 stories tall, and they would have lush gardens and pools with fish in them and water lilies and servants. And also, one of the things that they would do is they had makeup. They would have black eyeliner, basically. It was coal, and they believed that it was originally for a real purpose, right, to help with the glare of the sun. And so that cat eye look that you see was true that they did do that. They had makeup. Sometimes also they had wigs because they would shave their head to keep the lice from being a problem. Okay. The middle class is going to be artisans, and they would produce, right, the jewelry and linen cloth and things like that. So the upper class would wear that white cloth and jewelry and be kind of fancy. The middle class, of course, would be a little less fancy, a little simpler, and the lower class is the one that's going to be the one where the farmers are, right, and they're going to work the land that's owned by the nobles. So just like we talked about in other places, they would kind of rent the land. They'd pay for it with the crops, a portion of the crops, and of course they're going to live in a smaller mud brick house, probably just one room. The roof would be palm leaves, and they'd have a more simple diet versus, the rich. They would, the unskilled, the lowest is doing the manual labor, right? Since they don't have any skill, they would do things like, unload the boats and bring the cargo in, or sometimes they were the fishermen, okay? They, of course, are living even in more crowded neighborhoods in the city, in very small mud brick houses with like dirt floors, and it would be so hot and crowded that they'd often cook out and even sleep out maybe on the roof to try to stay cooler. Okay, some of those in that bottom might also be slaves from wartime, and you could try to earn your freedom over time. Okay. All right, so I had the picture there to show you the makeup. The one on the right is from a famous movie, Liz Taylor, and she they tried to get it accurate, but they did really wear that like blue makeup too and everything. Okay, the father is the head of the family, like we've talked about in other civilizations, but women did have a little bit more rights in this society than other civilizations. They could buy and sell property and goods. They could get divorced. They're allowed to get divorced, right? If you're wealthy, you might even get to serve as a priest or manage a temple or be in a religious ceremony. If you're not as wealthy, like a farmer's wife, you would still work with your husband, probably out in the fields, right? If you have a little bit more money, if you're kind of higher than that, they might get to stay home while their husband worked. The kids had a pretty good life. They did not go to school, right? Only few were scribes. And so most kids played board games and had dolls. We found spinning tops and stuffed leather balls. And they were taught to respect their parents, we know. and the skills of the parent would be passed on to the child, right? So the women would usually teach the girls how to sew and cook and run a household, and boys, you'd be taught your father's trade, so that you could, your oldest son at least would take over the business someday. Teenagers were expected to get married, so you would get married and have a kid, and start your family younger than you'd expect. All right.